This podcast was recorded on the ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation.
This is Humans on Rights, a podcast advocating for the education of human rights. Here's your host, Stuart Murray.
Tuesday, June 7th is World Food Safety Day. Well, we can talk about food safety, which is the need for people to have food that is free of contamination. That's the definition according to the World Food Security Council. And food security is the need for people to have access to food. We're going to talk a little bit about both. On today's podcast, my guest is Dr. Natalie Riediger. She's an assistant professor of food and human nutritional sciences in the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences. And she is driving discovery and understanding how to effectively address nutrition-related health inequities amongst oppressed populations as one area of her work. It's interesting that, and I'm going to ask her about this because I was interested to find out that Natalie was the recipient of the 2020 Terry G. Falconer Memorial RH Institute Foundation Emerging Research Award. That sounds like a houndful. We're going to find all about it. Natalie Riediger, welcome to Humans on Rights.
Thank you, Stuart, for having me.
Natalie, we talked at the top about maybe a land acknowledgement. Please feel free if that's something you would like to start the podcast on.
Yes, well, you acknowledged, I think that you're on Treaty 1 territory as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation, and I am as well in the basement of my home. So I'm very grateful to live here in these lands and, of course, eat the food that is produced from these lands. Oh, yeah, and I'm looking forward to chatting today.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. So before we get into, all of the great work you're doing clearly at the University of Manitoba, let's start from the beginning. You were born in Winnipeg?
I was born in Winnipeg, at the Women's Hospital.
And tell me a little bit about your early education and where you went to school and what ultimately got you interested in becoming the PhD and doing the studies you're doing. But what did you do and where did you go to high school?
So I grew up in North Kildonan. I went to Westgate Mennonite Collegiate from grade 7 to grade 12. And my family had a grocery store in Winnipeg's inner city at the corner of Isabel and Ross across from the Freight House Community Center. And that's where I spent a lot of my time growing up. So I'd go there even as a child, I'd say weekly, and then started working there regularly as soon as I was old enough to work there. And I worked there regularly throughout high school and part of my undergraduate education until I got into research and then kind of worked there casually all the way through to my PhD when it closed in 2012.
So your folks decided to close it in 2012?
Yeah, well, after 75 years, I would say the business wasn't really viable anymore. It's a very tough business, I'd say, to sell food in a community that's food insecure. And part of it was just, it was time. 4 generations of us worked there. And, the landscape for the grocery business had changed a lot during that time.
But that's like being an institution in that community, right? I mean, 4 generations, it's, people would know, your grandparents, your parents, who you are. In that community, you see people coming through the doors and you get to know their family and their kids and what they're doing. So it's very much a community, I would think.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'd say a lot of my work now is still community based and a lot of that was inspired through that work because our business survived for a long time because of those relationships with community organizations, the schools. We delivered to a lot of the school lunch and breakfast programs in the area. And certainly, I didn't work there regularly near to the end as much as my dad and my uncle, who had a lot of relationships in the community and, I think still attend funerals of people they met through that work. And I still see people, that I remember from working there. And I still have friends who I keep in contact with. And so, yeah, it was a very big part of our lives.
When you think back on that, Natalie, growing up with a family business, particularly, running a grocery store in a community, and building those relationships. Share just a couple of your sort of fondest memories of what you think back of those times that maybe has had an impact to help you motivate you to what you're currently doing today.
I'd say in terms of fondest memories, it's obviously the relationships, and not that many people, I don't think, get the chance to work with their family. So that's something that I really, look back positively. Like I got to work with my grandfather, my brothers and my cousins. And so that was positive. And also the relationships in the community. Like we were very close with a lot of customers. I knew most of the people who came in there, especially when I was working regularly certain days, just like, still today, most people have their schedule of how they go grocery shopping. So I knew the people who came in Fridays and Saturdays. And when I was working, social assistance checks were still checks, not deposited in accounts. So you get to know people's names through that way too, because they would come in and use their checks to purchase groceries. So you know their name and their address, because we did deliveries. So we go, into their homes. And a big part of my job was also taking deliveries orders. So I talked to a lot of people on the phone. This was before any other grocery stores did delivery. And so, that was also an important service that I think we provided. And, for some people, just talking to somebody on the phone, giving your grocery order is an important part of their day. So, there's lots. I could go on for forever about a lot of the positive memories. But there's also struggle. And so I'd say that's kind of also what has motivated me. Like you see a lot of problems and you experience a lot of problems in the system, the food system and the social assistance system, that impacts families' ability to access food. And we spent a lot of our effort trying to respond to those, and you can only do so much.
So, Natalie, I agree. I think there's, things that you learn, the goods and the bads and the challenges that you see. The one thing I just want to before we leave the grocery business, I just want to, tell you that, growing up as a kid, I was a Boy Scout or a Cub, whatever you want. And we used to have National Shoe Shine Day where you would have your Macintosh apples and you would, basically have an apple and you would shine shoes. And, that's how you would sort of generate a little bit of revenue. My point being is that when I go in today to buy apples, like they have, 15 different kinds of apples. I always sort of thought Macintosh was kind of the apple, but that is really quite obviously that's growth. There's organic apples and there's different kinds, pink ladies, Fiji. There's so many different apples. You wouldn't have seen any of that in your day. Things were a little bit more maybe focused, I would think.
Maybe I'm dating myself. I remember a lot of those apples. Yeah, Granny Smith, Pink Lady, Gala. But yeah, even it's funny. I was just telling somebody the other day, I don't remember, we never sold avocado. We had a pretty broad produce selection, but I don't recall ever having avocado. So that's something that's kind of new. And definitely there's a lot more fruits and vegetables and different types of, I'd say, food products today.
For sure.
Than there was even then. And of course, we have pictures of the store from the 30s and 40s and 50s. So I do appreciate how much the availability of different foods has changed over time. Yeah.
And I think, to your point, though, Natalie, is that what you probably witnessed were, from time to time, there were people that would come in that maybe their entire paycheck might go to purchasing their food. And for some, you get a chance to understand some of their backgrounds and some of the struggles they're having as families because you know them. You get to know who they are. And, that I think is of course, and we don't have to get into this, but that's so missing in today's food world. It's, massive stores, massive islands, massive shopping carts. But let's talk a little bit about, what food security means and how is it that you studied from high school, you went into university, you've got your bachelor's, then you've got your master's and now your PhD. How did you start to really drill down on what you felt was the importance of food security?
Well, I'd say my path wasn't, I guess, totally direct. My undergraduate and master's degrees were in nutrition. So I would say food and nutrition was kind of my first interest. And the program at the time, and I'd say somewhat still is, it's very biomedical focused in terms of the effects of nutrients and health, and not that I'm still interested in that, but I would say there wasn't a large focus on social determinants of health, like the social factors that influence how people eat and access food. And so I was really interested in kind of that bigger picture, and I did my PhD in public health. So that kind of gave me more of a bigger picture kind of training. And my PhD research was more focused on diabetes epidemiology, which is very much related, I would say, to food security. So then I came back once I finished my PhD and eventually got a faculty position. Once you're at the university in a faculty position, you have a lot of leeway, I would say, to kind of research what interests you. And so then I was kind of a bit like a kid in a playground, and now I can do what I want.
So Natalie, let me just sort of frame this conversation for 1 second. When the word food security comes up, when I was kind of doing my research before we got into this conversation, part of me in my mind was thinking food security, well, that means that when I go to whatever retail food store that I choose, and, I'd name a food store if they were sponsoring this podcast. None of them are, so I'm not going to name them. But, you go into a store and food security simply is that, well, yeah, there's going to be food on every aisle I go to. There's going to be shelves. They're going to be all stocked. I mean, that says food security. Really, that is, not really the definition of when you look at sort of from your perspective, from a health perspective and from a human right perspective, that's not what food security is about. Am I correct?
So there's lots of different definitions of food security. I'd say the most global, broad definition that's used includes 4 pillars. So that's availability of food. And that's kind of what you just described is, there's food in the grocery store and it's there, it's available. We have it. The second pillar is access. So in Canada, generally, when we talk about food insecurity and when we measure it in surveys, we're focused primarily on economic access. So can people afford it? And, there's different components of access, but I'd say economic access is the primary one in which we look at. In other contexts, and certainly in Indigenous contexts, we can consider, do people have the hunting equipment, the fishing equipment, the boat, et cetera. In terms of access. And then the third pillar is utilization. For example, you may have a grocery store full of food, but if you're an infant and there's no infant formula, which is a problem right now, there's nothing you can utilize. And utilization can also take many forms. Perhaps you have food, but you don't have a stove to cook it, right? You can't eat raw pasta. And then the fourth pillar, which is really cross-cuts availability, access, and utilization, is stability. So you can think of stability in terms of availability relating to climate change. We just had a severe drought here last summer, and so that impacts our stability. Of course, Canada has, we're pretty stable in terms of our food supply, but things like, the war in Ukraine is obviously going to have a major destabilizing aspect on the supply of food, global supply. And then access. I think of income cycles. Somebody might be able to get food when they get their social assistance check, but then by the end of the month, no longer have access to food. So those are kind of how we generally conceptualize food security. That's my long-winded answer.
Listen, it's fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, those 4 pillars, availability, access, utilization, and stability. I mean, there's so much to unpack in each one of those. And we'll come back to that, Natalie, but just maybe let's flip this around and talk about, food insecurity. What impact does that have on the population?
I'd say everything. We probably don't really appreciate how important food security is. I'm in a nutrition department, and most people probably think of nutrition. And of course, that's really important, and especially at key periods of growth, pregnancy, infants, childhood. Not having sufficient nutrition can have detrimental impacts on health. I'd say probably less well appreciated is conflict. Food insecurity can cause conflict, can also be caused by conflict. When there's scarce resources, people need to compete. We also see that, in Canada, even injuries, violence are more common in food insecure communities because resources are just so scarce.
So on that, Natalie, let's talk a little bit about that. When you say injuries are caused by food insecurity or by conflict, am I understanding that correctly? Can you just explain that a little bit, or what you mean by that?
Well, I think it's part of experiencing poverty. We know that in communities where there's greater poverty, there's more violence, injuries, because it's kind of part of the social context of scarcity, because people need to eat. And so you need to find ways to access food, and people can turn to different risky behaviors or work, selling drugs or sex work that maybe they wouldn't have done if they had access to the resources that they needed. And I'm talking about, this is in a global context, but I think this also happens in Canada. And that is probably underappreciated and under-researched is how much not having access to the basics of life, they're not direct, but it's an indirect effect on health. I'd say infectious disease. There is research in Canada that people who are food insecure are more likely to also have infectious disease. And some of that is partially nutritional because you're more at risk of infectious disease, but it's also, it's not just nutrition. It's how then you manage food insecurity that then can increase your risk of acquiring various kinds of infectious diseases too.
The thing that always amazes me, when you sort of do some research and sort of get into these conversations, is my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm not correct in my statement, but I believe that, and this is a global comment, that there is enough food that is available or prepared, and I'll use maybe the term accessible with a caveat on accessibility, but accessible for everybody in the world. Yet so many people go hungry. And if I could just even come back a little bit and bring it to Manitoba, because I know you've done some studies around, sort of oppressed populations. Why is it from your perspective, if you can share, that people go hungry?
Well, like you said, in Canada, it's not a matter of not having the food. Obviously, we're a food producing nation. So it's not the fact that we don't have it. It isn't primarily an access issue, and which disproportionately impacts First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations in Canada, as well as other populations. We know that Black Canadians, refugees also experience food insecurity disproportionately. And so a lot of that is shaped by, for Indigenous people, colonialism and the historical impact of that in terms of distance. And I'm talking now about, northern or remote communities, because we've centralized or prioritized this market food system in terms of how, when settlers came and now we have grocery stores here, right? There weren't grocery stores before settlers. So we have this market food system that settlers have made, Indigenous people now rely upon. And so that costs more than to ship food, for example, up north and to remote communities. So the price is very high. So that's one reason. But of course, even in, say, Winnipeg, where I worked for many years, we don't have that shipping issue. And so I don't think it's exclusively a shipping issue or exclusively a price issue. It kind of misses the point, because it's kind of the whole system that, many people here in Winnipeg struggle to afford food and are food insecure.
Natalie, has COVID had an impact on food insecurity?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How has it impacted, or how has COVID-19 had more of an impact on food insecurity than perhaps even before? What's the multiplier there, and what's the impact?
I think we're still working to figure out the exact impact. There have been some surveys. Statistics Canada did a survey, I think, early on in the first wave, and we know that household food insecurity increased during that time. We know that food bank usage went up during that time. Obviously, there were huge economic shocks in terms of people losing jobs. And so that's an aspect of the instability, that I talked about in terms of a core pillar of food insecurity. So that instability was a challenge. And of course, now we're dealing with inflation, which is also aggravating existing food insecurity and also getting newer people who are previously food secure kind of into this food insecure realm, even if they are working. And so it's important to know that a lot of people who are food insecure they're working and they're still food insecure. And so some of this has to do with, wages. And I know in Manitoba, we just announced we're raising the minimum wage. So there's lots to it. And I mean, globally now there's a war in the Ukraine, which is a major food producer. So that's going to cause also a lot of challenges, as that the supply that would have come now be impacted. And my understanding of that situation is Ukraine mostly exports to Africa. And so those countries will be feeling the effects of that.
I think one of the challenges with all of that, as we look at the impact, because everything is really interconnected globally. You talk about what's happening in Ukraine. You're absolutely right. Yeah, you look, in kind of Western Canada, we're, always, kind of when I was growing up on a farm, we were always sort of considered ourselves to be the breadbasket for the world. And there's probably a lot of truth in that. But, when you take a major supplier out of the food chain, there isn't somebody that just can automatically start replanting a crop that's going to produce in days or weeks or months. I mean, the cycle is huge. And so do you see that as, sort of an opportunity for other ways to look at bringing when I say other kinds of food, Natalie, I'm not even quite sure. Let me kind of think about that, what I'm saying there. It's just that, a lot of times people are very creative and they figure out different ways if something happens and they're trying to fill a gap. Is there other elements of nutrition, maybe is a better way to look at it? Is there other elements of nutrition that might come in to backstop where some of those foods that people were looking for that are not available anymore, just to ensure that there's still nutrition in their diet?
I'm not the producer expert. I would say that I've heard from, agricultural economists and people with expertise in this area that, there will be some other backstop, because it's not a perfect, we produce this year what people are going to eat next year. But part of the effects will be the prices are going to rise across the board for those foods that were grown by Ukraine, which are major staples like wheat. So there will be some backstop. I'd say the challenge, I guess, is that we get most of our calories from staple crops. And that's more the case for food insecure populations, where the majority of the calories come from staple crops. So hopefully, other countries can, as well as locally grown, food is grown in Africa as well. We'll start to fill that in with other foods, but we're also dealing with climate change. And that's really having, I think, detrimental effects, because we're having these shocks, and it's very difficult to prepare for events you're not anticipating, right? Like a flood or a drought. There's challenges there. And so certainly we have to rely globally on other producers. And I think that will continue to be really important. But there's going to be challenges, I think, ahead.
For sure. And when we looked at the 4 pillars that you talked about, availability, access, utilization, stability, let's just talk a little bit about access, because you talked about sort of the economic access. And what I really liked, Natalie, is the way you sort of framed that in this position, say, for example, First Nations, if they're talking about sustenance. So the ability to have a boat, or to have the availability to go out and sort of capture fish or whatever it may be, or if it's bow and arrow hunting, or if it's gun hunting to, capture deer or whatever it might be, or moose, to use that as sustenance. That economic access is really interesting. Talk about, from your perspective, where you see some of the challenges around that access.
Well, I'd say a lot of it is primarily economic, again, because it costs to get a gun, it costs to get a boat or a snowmobile or what have you that you need to go out and hunt. So the government of Canada has made a program now, because there was criticism initially for programs that were primarily focused on market foods, because we should be supporting Indigenous communities to access food how they want to access food. So there are, I think, more programs to support that. That's not my area for research specifically, so I'm not sure how effective those programs have been. But of course, even if you would then have the equipment now, if there's lots of, and we are seeing this in the north, I know, dwindling animal populations, that's also becomes a challenge, right? If the animals aren't there, if the fish aren't there, if there's hydro development and now you have to learn where the fish are now, because environments are changing and they're changing quickly. So that goes back to availability. They're really all interrelated. And so I think anytime having economic access, financial means, anytime one of those pillars is impacted, those who have the most resources will be able to deal better with these kind of shocks, right?
Everything is interconnected. You can't just sort of take a pillar out and sort of say, okay, we can work on 3 pillars. There's 4 pillars there. The availability, I should say, and access, as you talk about, is tied in. You touched on something that here we are in 2022, and it's making news headlines around is the lack of infant formula, and you look at utilization as one of those areas. What's your sense of what's happened, why we're out of, or maybe you're not aware, which is fair enough, the shortage of infant formula? Have you got a comment on that?
I'm not that familiar with the situation, other than that I know it is a problem. My understanding, I think, is it's one producer, Abbott, is not producing. Something happened in one of their plants. Sorry, I haven't been keeping up with who's there.
Yeah, no, it happens to, it's just kind of in the news. I just didn't know if it was something that had crossed your desk or something you wanted to share on that. But so maybe let's just back it up a little bit, Natalie, and talk from a utilization standpoint. Is there anything in your research when you look at one of those pillars that you can share the importance of what utilization means?
Well, I recently did a project looking at dietary gluten avoidance, because 2% of Canadians avoid gluten, 1% of whom most likely have celiac disease, who can't eat things like wheat, which is a staple in our diet. And so for individuals who have celiac disease and live in societies where they can't eat the staple, utilize the staple, there's different challenges there. And thinking about a non-nutritional impact is, we know that people who avoid gluten are less likely to go to restaurants because they can't eat the food there. And so, and that impact is less, I'd say, nutritional, as more social, but that also impacts health, as we've all experienced in these last 2 years. When you can't go socialize, go to somebody's house and eat, or go to a restaurant and eat, it impacts our quality of life. And we see that with people who have celiac disease as well. That also impacts people with food allergies. And so when you kind of add those two together, it's not a negligible part of the population. That's probably upwards of almost 10%, who probably more so, that have different, I'd say, food intolerances that struggle.
Yeah, I just, as sharing a personal note for a sec, Natalie, we're very blessed, and we have the opportunity to travel with some friends through Europe, and one of them happens to be celiac. And it's interesting that before we order, she always has a bit of a translation, depending on what country we're in, with their language, to present, to let them know that she is celiac. And I would say that I am really impressed with European restaurants. And I'm talking about, by the side of the road, or, a 1 or 2 star, better in an urban setting restaurant. They seem to be very, very in tune to issues around celiac and gluten. And it's not like you have to explain it to them. They kind of get it. And we've never, ever had an issue. But I want to just sort of talk about the gluten piece for a second, because I do think, and I want to reference one of your articles where people look at not taking gluten because they feel it will help with their diet. Maybe comment on that.
Sure. So I don't know if this myth, maybe it still persists to the same extent, but for sure, a number of years ago, I would say it was more of a fad to avoid gluten. I don't think, and from our research, it's not like it's a huge fad or that there's a lot of people who are avoiding it completely or excluding it completely for bad reasons or for weight loss reasons, but there are some. And certainly that has kind of gone around social media. There's no evidence to suggest that anybody who doesn't have, celiac disease or not, there's also non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So I hate to make a blanket statement because people should talk to their physician. There might be other reasons why some individuals don't tolerate gluten. Some people experience relief from symptoms from irritable bowel syndrome as well. But for the most part, it's not, avoiding gluten is not a recommended weight loss regime. There's no evidence to suggest that does anything that leads to weight loss. And so that's a myth.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I hope to dispel that. There's no, I eat gluten for people who don't have any, bowel troubles, or there's no ill health effects from consuming gluten.
Yeah, no, interesting, because I do think as you say, Natalie, it becomes a fad. People sort of jump on it. Somebody writes a book on it. The next thing you know, there's a podcast about it, and people are, getting their information from somewhere, whether it's accurate or not. They what they want to believe. People are always looking for that instant opportunity to lose weight, which I just don't know that that's out there. So let me just jump on for a second. The fourth pillar, we talked about stability. Give us some background on why that's important when you talk about food security.
I think stability matters. Maybe I shouldn't say the most, but I'm very interested in stability. I'm interested in doing more research around stability because I think it's probably underappreciated in terms of nutritionally, but also stress of having shocks. For people who are on social assistance, say in Canada, have these regular, I'll call them monthly instability, where you get monthly, or maybe you get Canada Child Benefit, and then you have influxes of funds to access food, but then there's inevitable shortages every month, and that's something that I definitely observed working in a grocery store, that people have regular shortages or periods of instability, and I think that has impacts nutritionally when you're eating perhaps a lot during certain periods of the month and less at another period. It also has impacts on stress, I would say, which impacts a lot of, our bodies in terms of our physical health. And then I think the other, in terms of availability, is climate change, and even things like this rise in inflation in food prices, that's a major kind of shock to our stability and our availability of food. Because sometimes there's been lots of shortages, I'd say, over the last couple of years. You couldn't get cornflakes for a while. And then there was the aluminum shortage. And so there's different things, and those are fairly minor because we still have other foods. And now there's formula, which is, of course, much more dire because, there's a population that's their exclusive food or a much bigger part of their diet than, say, cornflakes, and I've noticed different times there's certain produce that's not available. So I'd say that type of instability also, I'd say it's more indirect in terms of just our experience of the food system. Like, okay, I'm sure a lot of people are already feeling, and I'm sure in the US with the formula, it's kind of an ongoing stress of, will there be another period of instability? What's going to go up next? And then that's kind of why we also had that panic buying earlier in the pandemic. It's like, oh my goodness, am I not going to have food next week? So now I got to stock up, which of course then has other effects on other people. Okay, now that person's panicking, I should buy more.
And I don't think that anybody, has ever answered the question, Natalie, about the toilet paper shortage. I know that that's not a food issue. But to this day, I do not understand, and nobody has able to explain the panic on buying toilet paper. Hardly any one of the four pillars, I get it. But, it's just one of those panic things that sets in and everybody sort of just pivots to it and away they go. Any comment on that?
There was definitely panic buying, but I think part of the issue that people maybe didn't think about is, all these people were going to work and school and going to the bathroom at work and school for the majority of your day. And so now no longer are the majority of your toilet paper needs at work or school. They're now at home. But I didn't steal the university's toilet paper. Maybe I should have.
Yeah, well, maybe there's a stocked up somewhere, Natalie. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was one of the articles that you wrote, and it's called "A Syntax on Sugary Drinks Unfairly Targets Indigenous Communities Instead of Improving Health." What got you motivated to write that, and how can we improve that situation?
Oh, that's a good question. So I wrote that article with Myra Tate, who's at Athabasca University, and she's an expert in tax law, First Nations tax law. So that's one of a few articles now I've written on sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. And that's a very big topic. It might seem small, but because I've been researching it now for a few years. That article was specifically written thinking about First Nations in mind. And I'll leave the tax part aside because that's not my specific expertise. That's Myra's expertise. The focus of sugar-sweetened beverages, to me, has been somewhat taken out of, it's been looked at from an ahistorical, apolitical lens, not really thinking about why, people drink sugar-sweetened beverages or why they're disproportionately consumed by Indigenous people, and including First Nations. It didn't occur in a vacuum. And so I think part of my research is really to get people to think, I think, more deeply about why people consume sugar-sweetened beverages, how that happened, and kind of the historical context that has gotten us here. And to also think about health more broadly, because it's proposed to tax, I'll just say pop, to improve people's health outcomes. Again, not thinking about all the broader aspects that influence people's lives and why they might consume pop, because we know that people who consume pop are disproportionately lower income and food insecure. And so we're proposing to raise the price of a food that's consumed by people who are food insecure. And so there's a tension there. And so proponents of the policy think, well, that's who will then drink less of it. And that may be the case. There will be people who will consume less because the price is being raised, but there will also be people who will continue to consume it because the price of the other foods hasn't changed and people still need to eat. And the reasons people drink it have not been addressed. And so we also need to think about the health of people who will continue to consume it. And in that article specifically, we were talking about water because you need to have something else to drink. And if you don't have clean drinking water, that's a pretty basic human right that has not been addressed. And I think working from the basics up should be kind of the approach rather than trying to police what people eat instead of getting those basic human rights there. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, I mean, it's a lot to unpack again, Natalie, when you look at that. And I just want to come back to one of the comments that you made about the historical context of how it is that we got here, that we're looking at this. From what your research shows, what historically did kind of drive us to a point where there's a sense that the economics, as opposed to health, looking at the health of people, you look at it and say, well, if we economically tax and quote unquote with the idea, presumably of taking it out of their ability to purchase it, that they're going to pivot and go to some other place or do something different.
I have to think about how I'm going to answer this. When I'm talking about historical, I'm thinking even way back, like, why do we even have sugar The history of sugar is the history of colonialism. We have sugar in our diets because of slavery. So that's how, this became a big part of our diets in, I'd say, for sure, the Western population. Obviously, India is a major producer of sugar and other places as well. But in terms of, when settlers came in the Caribbean, and the southern states, in terms of sugar producing states, that was a big part of it. And then now all pop in Canada and the US is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. So now that there's no longer slavery, we've stopped taking sugar from those sugar producing areas. And now we're subsidizing white farmers growing corn on stolen land, but it's causing ill health to marginalized populations. And they're profiting off of the selling corn, even though Indigenous people domesticated corn first, in North America. And now we're proposing the government to profit off of oppressed populations consuming it. It's not random that they're consuming it disproportionately because we've made it cheaper compared to other products. And also everybody consumed pop before. And food patterns often follow this pattern, like higher income, higher class populations will consume something first, and then later, lower income or lower class populations will then consume it. And we didn't punish ourselves for consuming it. And the reason it causes ill health is complicated by, poverty and food insecurity.
If you look at that lens, Natalie, would you have a suggestion to how we could sort of move away from the taxation piece on things like sugary drinks to looking at the health element of it? I ask it not that it's a simple answer for a very difficult question, but I just wondered, in your research, or just even you as a person whose family ran grocery stores, you lived it, what might you sort of see as a way to try to move away from the sugary drinks into more of a health conscious environment?
I think there's a lot of different things we can do. In the research, we've heard from people that having lower sugar in drinks, it doesn't need to be as high as it is. That's one option. Obviously, addressing food insecurity, that's a big challenge. We know that, for example, there's been recent research on the Canada Child Benefit that was implemented now 5 years ago. So families who receive the Canada Child Benefit, who are lower income, particularly renters, utilize most of that benefit to purchase food. I think it was almost 40% of that benefit. And we know that old age security is also associated with reduced food insecurity. So we know that providing, and those can be considered kind of some form of basic income because they're both progressive policies, help to address food insecurity. And so I think from the spending perspective, making sure that people have the means to purchase food is important. I realize, because I'm studying tax, that money doesn't come from nowhere. So, I do believe we need to look at our taxation system in terms of, is it progressive enough? Are we taxing the most wealthy? Are they contributing their fair share? These are big societal questions about, and I'm going to come back to the land. And I think Indigenous people often come back to the land. This is the source of, most of Canada's economic success is natural resources. And that's where the bulk of our tax revenue is coming from. And so how are we going to reconcile that as a society? I think very much has to do with our taxation system. That's not a very big conversation. That hasn't happened, but I think about that a lot because it's kind of hard not to go there. So what's fair, I think, is that something that as a society we need to, tackle.
Right. What I love about these conversations, Natalie, is that we started talking about food security, food safety. We've now kind of gotten into the taxation system, but they're all intertwined. So I kind of love the way that you've weaved that story. My guest today, Dr. Natalie Riediger. Natalie, I'd like to get sort of a sense for those that might be listening. When you talk about the issue to educate, to mobilize, and then really hopefully that people will take action, what would you like people to, from an action standpoint, think about when they think about food safety and food security?
Well, I think there's the bulk of the change has to come at the systems level. So I'd say get engaged politically with, voting for candidates who have food security and food safety on the agenda. Individually, I think there's lots you can do in terms of, supporting your community, not wasting. Food waste is also a major contributor to food insecurity. These are small things, but I think that they're, something everybody can get involved in. And also, if you are food secure, be grateful.
Yeah, that is something I think that we need to be reminded of on a day-by-day basis. And so I appreciate you kind of wrapping this whole conversation up with that. Be grateful. I think it's a great way to go. So, Natalie, thank you so much for spending some time talking about food safety, food security, and a little bit of taxation. Always a good opportunity to learn. So I thank you very much for the good work that you have done and continue to do. And I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today on Humans on Rights.
Thanks for having me, Stuart.
Humans on Rights is recorded and hosted by Stuart Murray. Social media marketing by the creative team at Full Current in Winnipeg. Thanks also to Trixie May Bituin. Music by Doug Edmond. For more, go to humanrightshub.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.